The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everyone.
So, I gotta say, it's been a real long week for us. We just finished putting the final touches on Beth's latest book and getting it published on Amazon. So, we're not really going to do any housekeeping this episode.
It was a lot of work, but I have to say I'm really proud of this book, and it was a labor of love. So if any of you are into reading historical fiction, it's called Fear of Madness, and it's about Lucretia Davidson, who is a local historical figure here, and she was a poet and passed away at a very young age, but she had an incredible life, and I really enjoyed putting the book together and researching, and it's a fictional account. It's not a biography or anything like that, but it's worth checking out. So if you're interested, you can click on our book tab at our website, whereourmindswander.com, or you can just go on Amazon and type in Fear of Madness.
Yeah, and what's really cool about that, way back in the day, she lived next door to where our house is.
Literally right next door.
Which is pretty cool.
It's very cool.
So if you got the time, go check it out. It might be something that you're interested in. Well, I guess as always, Beth, you should get us started tonight. So would you like to tell everyone where your mind wandered for this episode?
Yes, I'm going to start off by saying that Frank Lenz loved bicycles. He received his first bike as a gift at the age of 17 and quickly joined the Allegheny Cyclers. As a young man, he became an accountant and saved up enough money to buy a Columbia Roadster with 35-inch wheels, and soon after made his first century ride from Pittsburgh to Newcastle and back. 2 months later, he rode from Pittsburgh to New York City and back. Then 1,200 miles from Pittsburgh to St. Louis, and then from Pittsburgh to New Orleans. And so it made sense for the young cyclist to try something few had done before him. At age 25, Lenz decided to circumnavigate the globe on his bike. I should probably mention that the year was 1892. Frank Lenz's story is pretty remarkable, especially since he never actually finished his trip, and his disappearance is still a mystery. Lenz was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1867. He lived with his mother and stepfather. As a young man, he worked as an accountant for a brass manufacturer, but numbers weren't really his passion. Cycling was. His first century rides were non-competitive. He rode because he wanted to. According to adventurecycling.org, he made a second trip to New York City in 1889. Only this time he rode with his Blair box camera and tripod strapped to his back. During the 3-week journey, he took around 150 photographs. Now, keep in mind, this was when photographs were on glass plates. He photographed street scenes and public buildings, anything pretty much that struck his fancy. The local paper said he looked like a cross between, quote, a peddler, drummer, and quack doctor, end quote.
Well, he must have been quite the sight.
Yeah, with all that stuff he was carrying around. So, Lenz didn't go solo on his trips. He made friends with a fellow rider named Charlie Petticord. In the summer of 1890, the two of them made that 1,200-mile trip from Pittsburgh to St. Louis together. The following summer, in 1891, they rode together from Pittsburgh to New Orleans. He did try competitive racing, entering a century race from Erie to Buffalo. It was grueling, and he lost, but just barely. But then, in 1892, Lenz read about two men who had cycled across Asia, William Sachtelbahn and Thomas Allen. He already knew about his idol, Thomas Stevens, who rode across 25 countries between 1884 and 1887. Intrigued and sure that he and Charlie could do it themselves, 25-year-old Lenz wanted more than anything to try. All he needed was funding. And so, the ingenious young man appealed to Outing magazine, telling them that he would bring his Blair camera and take photographs during the entire 20,000-mile journey. During the 2-year-long trip, he'd begin in New York City, follow the Northern Pacific Rail line across the United States to San Francisco, then take a boat to Japan, where he would then ride across Asia and Europe. Again, according to AdventureCycling.org, Lenz caught the eye of Outing's editor, J.H. Warman, and the maker of Victor cycles, A.H. Overman. The two businessmen agreed to sponsor Lenz and Charlie's trip if they agreed to ride Victor's safety bikes and if they submitted regular reports and photographs to the magazine. Lenz was all set, despite his girlfriend Annie and his mother begging him not to go. But then, Charlie backed out at the last minute. Not to be thwarted, Lenz doubled down, choosing a Victor bike with a brand new invention, pneumatic tires. And he waved off the offer of bringing a Kodak film camera. He was going to stick with his Blair. He would do it all solo. And so, on May 15, 1892, Lenz put his foot to the pedal and took off from Pittsburgh. He estimated that with his gear, the bike was carrying a load of 240 pounds. When he arrived in New York City 3 weeks later, there was a grand send-off waiting for him, as the media proclaimed the, quote, globe girdler was about to make history. When asked if he was nervous, Lenz replied, quote, I have nothing but the most pleasurable anticipation of my trip abroad. Besides, I have never encountered anything yet that I have not overcome, end quote. He dutifully followed the Northern Pacific Rail line, although he did make detours for amazing places like Yellowstone National Park. While there, he remarked on the uncomfortableness of stagecoaches, saying, quote, my Victor was a good enough vehicle for me, and that no terrain was any match for his Victor pneumatic tires. He continued, quote, take your pneumatic and see the Yellowstone Park a wheel as I did, end quote. From San Francisco, he hopped on a boat headed for Japan. Once there, he cycled through the country for a month, taking in the sights of rice paddies and pagodas. According to the excellent article, A Brave and Resourceful Man, Frank Lenz, Cyclist, by Candace O'Connor, he also saw his very first red light district for the very first time.
Oh, my.
And then he was on to China, where he rode for 6 months. China was pretty rough, and not just the roads. The weather, bitter cold and snowy, was also a problem. And then there was at least one instance when the people were a problem too. According to O'Connor's article, Lenz mapped his route along telegraph lines, where he knew he could find shelter with the telegraph operators, or with the American missionaries he came across, all of whom advised him to abandon his trek, by the way. One day, however, he was almost taken down by a mob of farm workers who weren't entirely pleased by the odd-looking foreigner tooling by on his silver bike. He literally had to dodge punches while trying to negotiate the right to pass through their town. He also narrowly missed running into Sochtelban and Allen, the two men he had read about just a few months earlier. But he made it through and crossed into the jungles of Burma, which is now Myanmar. It was there that he caught malaria. It slowed him down, but he persevered, crossing into Tabriz in modern-day northwestern Iran. It was here that a little chink in his armor began to show, as he wrote to Outing magazine editor Warman that, quote, "I must confess to a feeling of homesickness. I am very, very tired of being a stranger. I long for the day which will see me again on my native hearthstone and my wanderings at an end." End quote. It was April of 1894, and Lenz was welcomed to Tabriz by the Crown Prince. He stayed for a week, recovering in both mind and body, before heading off on a caravan route towards Tehran, where he set his sights on Constantinople, Turkey, 1,100 miles away. He planned to make a pit stop in Erzurum. But then, according to AdventureCycling.org, a month passed, and Outing magazine anxiously awaited their expected report. Then June came and went. And then, in July, Lenz's mother received a cable from Thomas Cook & Sons, saying Lenz's trunk and mail awaiting him in Constantinople had not been picked up. For all anyone knew, Lenz had been missing for 3 whole months. The family contacted Warman at Outing magazine, who said he really wasn't all that worried. But he was. And he immediately began sending out inquiries to all of his contacts, trying to track Lenz down. Back in Pittsburgh, the Lenz family wrote letters to missionaries in Iran, Pakistan, and Turkey, asking if anyone had heard of or seen Frank Lenz. Their efforts revealed frustratingly little. One missionary named W.S. Vanneman claimed he had seen Lenz leave Tabriz, and he offered a little bit of hope that if Lenz had fallen ill while near any of the villages, he would be able to contact the outside world for help. But Lenz had disappeared somewhere between Tabriz and Erzurum, a 365-mile stretch along the modern-day Armenian border that was full of treacherous mountain passes and rivers. The nomadic Kurds along that area had been involved in massacres all along the route as well. Speculation began that he could have been injured, kidnapped, or killed. Others speculated that it was all a planned publicity stunt to sell more issues of Outing magazine. Charlie Petticord quickly rose to Lenz's defense, saying his friend would never intentionally hurt his mother by agreeing to such a thoughtless hoax. Back in New York, Werman sent Thomas Cook & Sons, who were based in Constantinople, a request to have native guides go look for Lenz. Due to the escalating conflict, the guides couldn't go. But reports from missionaries saying they had seen Lenz continued to come in. A Canadian named William Nesbitt Chambers said that he'd heard that Lenz had made it to the town of Diadin on May 7th, and that on the 9th he'd spent the night in a farmhouse in Chilcani, 50 miles further west. The British consul in Erzurum, Robert W. Graves, offered a gloomier explanation. He felt that it was likely that Lenz had been robbed, then killed, and that solving the mystery was unlikely. With that, the world, and Lenz's family, seemed to accept the grim conclusion that Lenz had been killed, and their goal shifted to recovering his body and bringing him home. Warman offered up one of his assistants, Robert Bruce, to investigate. Once Bruce found Lenz's remains, he'd finish Lenz's ride from Tehran to Constantinople for him. Lenz's family was less than thrilled, and they found their own investigator, William Sachtleben, one of the two men who had just completed their own world trek on a bicycle, the very same one who Lenz had read about and very nearly met back in China. Werman jumped on board with the Sachtleben idea, at least initially, signing a contract with him to go search. But he insisted that Sachtleben wait until the snow had melted, and it wasn't until March when he finally arrived in Constantinople, a full 10 months after Lenz's last known whereabouts. The search was held up even further by Alexander W. Terrell, the American minister to Turkey, who thought both cyclists were fools. The Turkish government had already looked for Lenz, and he didn't see any point in Sachtleben venturing out into such dangerous territory. Eventually, he did make it into Erzurum, where he met up with William Nesbitt Chambers, the Canadian missionary who had heard of Lenz's last location. By the time the two men were finally able to go search, it was May of 1895, an entire year since Lenz had disappeared. But they were still able to find some clues. Disturbing clues, but clues nonetheless. First, pieces of a bicycle had been discovered in the Hopaz River, about 6 miles from the village of Chilcani. Locals had a bell, and there were even rubber tubes hanging from a tree belonging to a local named Musto Nise. Second, there were rumors that a naked body had also been found in the Sherian River, which local authorities had buried in a Kurdish village. Sachtleben and Chambers felt that Nise was the murderer and that he had accomplices. It took another 6 months for the men to get official authorities to agree to search the houses belonging to the 6 men. It was determined that Nise and other men had most likely ambushed Lenz and killed him over a perceived slight. The story was that Nise had paid a friendly visit to the farmhouse in Chilcani to meet Lenz. When he arrived, Lenz was asleep, and when Lenz woke up to see Nise handling his revolver, Lenz snatched his gun from Nise's hands. Feeling humiliated, Nise ordered the attack on Lenz on May 10th. All 6 men escaped prison before the trial. However, some of the Armenian locals who helped solve the case also found themselves in prison, and a couple of them died while in prison. Lenz's remains were never found. And of course, without his remains, people felt compelled to come to other conclusions about the missing cyclist. Perhaps he loved Turkey so much that he decided to stay there, faking his own death and taking on a new identity. For the most part, Frank Lenz had been lost to history. Very few people know about the young man who dreamed of crossing the world on his bicycle in 1892. But then, in 2010, author David Herlihy published a book, The Lost Cyclist, the untold story of Frank Lenz's ill-fated around-the-world journey, shining a light on the remarkable young man's story. Perhaps, someday, his remains will be found, and the mystery of his disappearance will be solved.
Well, that took some balls to travel overseas.
By himself.
I know, it's too bad his friend couldn't have went with him.
I know, but at least he defended him when people started speaking badly of him and saying, oh, it was all a publicity stunt. And, at least he stepped in and said, no, that's hogwash.
Right. It would have been an incredible trip had he made it back.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, to go over there into a place that really little about, they may not be so nice to you.
Which I don't even know if that's something that crossed his mind. I mean, I think he was, I'm speculating, but maybe he was more in mind of, I'm going to see the world on my bike, and didn't really think about, I'm going to have to stay where people will allow me to.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think he loved riding his bike so much, and it was such an expedition for him that he really didn't think it through all the way.
Yeah. It's unfortunate, and hopefully, we always say this, hopefully we'll find answers. I mean, at this point, it was 1894, so probably unlikely, but you never know.
We'll be back right after this break.
Hey, did you know? The unlucky mummy housed at the British Museum isn't a mummy at all, but rather a mummy board or coffin lid. Many myths surround the infamous mummy board, including the unexpected deaths of the 4 young Brits who discovered it. What isn't a myth are the deaths of 2 British journalists who believed in the unlucky mummy curse. The first, William Thomas Stead, regaled passengers aboard the Titanic with stories of the unlucky mummy. Stead died in the sinking. The second was Bertram Fletcher Robinson, a journalist for the Daily Express, who researched the authenticity of the unlucky mummy curse until he became convinced of its validity. He died just 3 years later at the age of 36. Who'da thunk it?
All right, we're back.
Where did your mind wander this week?
Well, it's 1957 in the United States. Dwight D. Eisenhower and Richard Nixon are reelected for a second term. The country finds itself in the Cold War. Jimmy Hoffa finds himself behind bars, and Oklahoma celebrates 50 years of statehood. The Little Rock Nine are protected by federal troops on their way into a desegregated Arkansas school for the first time. Future astronaut John Glenn flies a supersonic jet from California to New York in just over 3 hours. Jack Kerouac publishes On the Road, and Allen Ginsberg's Howl is seized by U.S. Customs agents for being too obscene of a poem. Leave It to Beaver premieres on CBS, and 22-year-old Elvis Presley buys Graceland. And for 7 months during the year 1957, UFOs were being seen all over the U.S. and at least once in the U.K. Most of these encounters were still classified until fairly recently, so very few people even know about them. By themselves, looked at as isolated events, they're interesting to say the least. But when put together on a timeline and talked about in connection with each other, they're downright intriguing. On the night of May 20th, a U.S. Air Force pilot named Milton Torres was stationed at RAF Manston, an airbase near Kent, England, when he was ordered to intercept an unidentified flying object over East Anglia. The UAP looked to be as big as a B-52 bomber on radar, according to HowStuffWorks.com. He was ordered to fly at top speed in his F-86D Sabre jet, so about 700 miles per hour, and he was to unload all 24 of his missiles on it. According to a SeattleTimes.com article, Torres was just 15 miles away when he locked onto a target as big as an aircraft carrier, except he couldn't see it. Granted, it was nighttime, and he later said in an interview that he had struggled just to read codes on a scrap of paper that he had inside the cockpit, stating, "It was totally black and the lights were down for night flying. I used my flashlight, still trying to fly and watch my radar. To put it quite candidly, I felt very much like a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest." When he was just 10 seconds away from intercepting the unidentified aircraft, he still couldn't see it. But as he locked onto his invisible target and prepared to fire upon it, it totally vanished from his radar. When the shaken Torres returned to base, feeling guilty over not fulfilling his mission, and perplexed by what he had just experienced, his superiors told him to never talk about it again, and it was classified information. The next day, in order to get their point across, Torres was visited by an American, who he described in the Seattle Times article as a well-dressed IBM salesman with a dark blue trench coat. During the debriefing, the unidentified man warned him that he would be breaching national security if he ever spoke about his experience. And he didn't, until a RAF Manston reunion in 1988. He spoke with a military historian who said that since UFO files were destroyed by the U.S. government every 5 years, there was no way that he'd ever get his hands on any information. In retrospect, Torres expressed in the interview that he was actually glad that he hadn't been able to shoot at the aircraft, whatever it was, because he's convinced that it would have vaporized him in response. A little under 2 months later, in the early hours of July 17th, an RB-47 and her 6-man crew were flying a routine flight from Forbes Air Force Base in Topeka, Kansas, over Oklahoma, and then to Texas, before returning to base. The RB-47 aircraft had the most sophisticated electronic intelligence gear available at that time and was highly reliable. The crew, pilot Lewis Chase, co-pilot James McCoy, and electronic warfare officers Thomas Hanley, John Provenzano, and Walter Tuchscherer had done this routine before. It was part of their routine to check for ground radar signals, and as they began their flight, Frank McClure picked up what he thought was a ground radar signal, even though there had never been one at that spot before. He didn't mention it, however. But then, as the plane turned towards Meridian and Jackson, Mississippi, flying at 34,000 feet and at a speed of Mach 0.75, both Chase and McCoy saw what they thought were the landing lights of another jet coming in fast at the 11 o'clock position. They noted that the incoming aircraft had no navigational lights, just a single intense bluish-white light. Chase believed that the light was coming from something massive. According to HowStuffWorks.com, another aircraft appeared on their radar. Chase turned the RB-47 around to face it, and concerned that they were going to collide, Chase called for evasive maneuvers. However, as soon as he did, the unknown aircraft changed directions in a flash of light, and at an angular velocity that none of them had ever seen before. Then the craft shot out of the sky and disappeared. As the RB-47 continued its flight and its crew talked about what they had just seen, they also contacted the Duncanville, Texas Air Force ground radar station so that it could get a good second track on the remaining UFO in the sky. At 4:50 a.m., the Duncanville radar showed that as the RB-47 passed under this second ship, the UFO disappeared. When the incident was eventually declassified, the U.S. Air Force official word was that the RB-47 had simply encountered an airliner. 4 months later, on November 2nd, 2 immigrant farm workers named Pedro Saucedo and Joe Salez were driving about 4 miles west of Levelland, Texas. It was evening, and as the truck traveled along the road, they both saw a brilliant blue flash of light in the sky. The truck sputtered and died. As they sat there in disbelief, a rocket-shaped object appeared, heading straight for them. Terrified, Saucedo jumped out of the dead truck and hit the ground. Salez stayed in the truck. Saucedo later told the Levelland police that this rocket passed directly over them with a sound like thunder, and the truck, with Salez still in it, rocked violently side to side. On the ground, Saucedo felt a rush of hot wind over his body. As soon as this rocket passed by, the truck sprang back to life as though nothing had ever happened at all. Levelland police officer A.J. Fowler, who took the men's report, laughed it off. But then, an hour later, motorist Jim Wheeler called in with another report. Wheeler had been traveling about 4 miles east of Levelland when he had to stop because there was a brilliantly lit, egg-shaped object about 200 feet long just sitting in the road. As he was about to get out of his car, his vehicle just died, just like Saucedo's had. At the same instant, the lights on this egg-shaped craft also went out before it lifted into the air and just took off. Wheeler claimed that as soon as this craft was out of sight, his car sprang back to life as though nothing had ever happened. Officer Fowler may have wondered if Saucedo, Salez, and Wheeler were in cahoots with the wacky prank, but it was unlikely that the 3 men even knew each other. And then, more calls came in. A married couple driving northeast of Levelland called in to report that at around 10:55 p.m., they saw a bright blue flash of light traveling across the sky. At the same time, the headlights and radio of their car inexplicably died. Once the craft passed, their lights and radio came back on. At 11 p.m., just 5 minutes later, a man named Jose Alvarez called in to say he was driving 11 miles north of Levelland when he also had to stop, dead in the road, because a strange object was just sitting there blocking his path. Once he stopped, his vehicle died. Then the craft took off, and you guessed it, his car started right back up again. At 5 past midnight, a Texas Technological College student named Newell Wright was 10 miles east of Levelland when his car engine began to sputter. The ammeter of the dash jumped to discharge and then back to normal, and the motor started cutting out like it was out of gas. The car rolled to a stop, then the headlights dimmed, and several seconds later, went out. He didn't notice the 100-foot-long egg-shaped object sitting in the road until he got out to open his hood. Before he could even open it up, the craft took off and his car started right back up. Between 12:15 a.m. and 1:15 a.m. on November 3rd, the police station received 3 more separate calls from Frank Williams, Ronald Martin, and James Long. All 3 men had been in 3 different areas in Levelland and had 3 separate but identical encounters. By now, the Levelland police were investigating the rash of reports, and 2 officers saw the UFO for themselves, Sheriff Weir Clem and Fire Chief Ray Jones. Clem witnessed a bright red light traveling across the sky at 1:30 a.m., and Jones had his own car problems as his vehicle sputtered and died while he watched the egg-shaped craft fly overhead at 1:45 a.m. Altogether, 15 witnesses made reports, and the case did attract national attention, as well as the attention of Project Blue Book. The Air Force sergeant who was sent by Project Blue Book interviewed just 9 of the 15 witnesses, including Saucedo, Wheeler, and Wright. He concluded that Saucedo was an unreliable source because he only had an elementary school education. The sergeant chalked the whole thing up to ball lightning and wet electrical circuits in people's vehicles. Apparently, 15 people coincidentally suffered from wet electrical circuits and witnessed ball lightning miles away from Levelland in all directions. J. Allen Hynek, also of Project Blue Book, apparently had a lot of regrets when it came to how the Loveland incidents were investigated. He said in later years that if he hadn't been the sole person responsible for tracing Sputnik, he would have either investigated the case himself or been better about signing off on the explanations that the agent had given him regarding the case. Reflecting on the whole thing, Hynek pointed out that saying it was ball lightning was ridiculous, especially since no thunder or lightning was reported in the area at any point that night or previous day. He also pointed out that ball lightning can't cause cars to die in the middle of the road, and that all 15 witnesses should have been interviewed. The following day, on November 4th, the egg-shaped UFO showed up again, this time over 300 miles away, right on the runway of Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Known simply as the Kirtland incident, 2 Civil Aeronautic Administration controllers named R.M. Kaiser and E.G. Brink noticed something unusual during their shift at around 10:45 Mountain Standard Time. Stationed in the base's tower, the 2 men noticed a very bright white light traveling eastward across the airfield. They were able to catch it on radar for just a brief second as the light appeared to maneuver in ways that they had never seen before. Then, a dark object descended very quickly at the end of runway 26 and flew just a few dozen feet off the ground as it crossed the airfield. It was so close that the men could easily see it through their binoculars, and to them it appeared to be about 20 feet in height and in the shape of an elongated egg. The single white light came from the underside of the craft. Over the next 20 minutes, the egg-shaped UFO flew within 3,000 feet of the tower, where it hovered for a full minute, before slowly flying off, still relatively close to the ground to the eastern base boundary. Then it shot up at an incredible speed. From there, it turned south, and as it blipped across the radar, it appeared to circle the Albuquerque low-frequency range station for minutes. Then it turned around and headed back towards Kirtland Air Force Base, where it hovered over the north-south runway. Finally, it tailed a C-46 Commando, a low-wing twin-engine aircraft, at just a half a mile behind, and continued to tail it for 14 miles. Then, it just simply vanished. Project Blue Book got involved again, this time sending a Captain Scheer from an Air Force base in Colorado Springs. Although the 2 control tower officers were characterized by him as completely reliable and competent, Captain Scheer determined that all they had seen was a lost pilot who had mistakenly tried to land at Kirtland. Captain Scheer said the whole thing was easily explained by this likely theory. A private plane had somehow gotten turned around and mistaken the Air Force Base as a civilian airport, but once realizing their mistake, they had circled around and flown off. The analysis, by the way, was what made it into the Condon Committee's final report on UFOs. So yes, 2 experienced flight controller officers mistook a private plane for an elongated, egg-shaped UFO, matching the description of the egg-shaped UFO seen just 48 hours earlier in Levelland. So, whoever that private plane owner was, it seems like he really got around. So, were the 1957 UFO sightings really UFOs? Now, I've always liked the explanation that these craft are some kind of top-secret military planes that are still in the testing stages. But in this case, if that were so, how come we don't see elongated egg-shaped aircraft all over the place? Was it because they had a bad habit of landing on civilian roads and messing with cars? Just to be thorough, I did a quick Google search for the elongated egg-shaped planes, and I did find one. However, it wasn't tested until 2018. The Solera 500L, or bullet plane, will fly at about 460 miles per hour and carry 6 passengers. There have been 50 test flights of the bullet plane since 2018, and so far, it hasn't been able to reach speeds beyond 251 miles per hour, or an altitude higher than 17,000 feet. Which then begs the question, if we can't quite do it now, how were we doing it back in 1957? And I'd be interested in hearing any of our listeners' thoughts. So drop us an email and let me know what you think.
That's a lot of sightings for just 1 year.
Yeah, it's quite a few. And surprisingly, they're all egg-shaped.
I know. I was just going to say, you don't hear about egg-shaped craft very often. It's very unusual.
Yeah. I mean, you do hear about them once in a while, but mostly it's cigar-shaped or saucer-shaped.
Yeah.
So it is interesting.
Huh. Not to make light of it, but it makes me think of Mork from Ork, because he's the only one I know of that traveled in an egg.
Well, now that you mentioned it, maybe they took some of the egg-shaped UFO sightings and put them into their show.
Well, that makes sense.
Maybe that's where they got the inspiration of using the egg-shaped object for Mork.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Well, with that said, give him your spiel about the show notes.
So, as always, if you would like to know more about Frank Lenz or about the UFO sightings of 1957, you can always check our show notes.
Yeah, and they also have all the links to our website and our social media.
Yes, all that good stuff.
Well, with that said, that about wraps it up, Beth.
Alrighty.
Join us next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon.